Welcome, history enthusiasts, to our channel. Today we drift into the shadowed corners of London's past as we uncover the dark history of the Docklands. From crime and squalor to war and resilience, this is a story of human endurance along the mighty Thames. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more fascinating journeys into the forgotten stories of the past. Let's step back in time together and explore the hidden tales that shaped one of London's most infamous neighborhoods, London's Docklands. Today, when people hear that name, many think of sleek skyscrapers, glass-fronted offices, bustling cafes, and luxury apartments that rise high above the Thames. It is a modern landscape of prosperity, ambition, and global commerce, a place where bankers, professionals, and tourists walk along the riverside, gazing at the shimmering reflection of a city that is constantly reinventing itself. But beneath this glittering surface lies a past far darker, far more complex than the polished exteriors suggest. To truly understand London's Docklands, one must journey back in time to an era where these very waters and streets witnessed some of the most intense human struggle, suffering, and survival the city has ever known. This is a history of shadows, of a place where commerce and crime, wealth and destitution, life and death existed side by side in a way that would shape the city for centuries to come. The origins of the Docklands stretch back several centuries to a time when London was emerging as a vital trading hub in Europe. The Thames, winding through the heart of the city, became the lifeblood of commerce, connecting London to ports across the continent and eventually to the distant corners of the globe. As ships arrived carrying goods that ranged from spices and tea to textiles and tobacco, the riverside became a bustling, chaotic center of trade. Warehouses, wharves, and piers sprang up along the banks, creating a labyrinthine network of storage and transport that was unmatched anywhere in the world at that time. The sheer scale of activity transformed the Docklands into a vital artery of London's economy, but it also introduced conditions that would make the area infamous for centuries. For every ship that docked and every crate of goods unloaded, there were men and women whose labor was exploited, whose lives were precarious, and whose stories were often ignored or forgotten. The Docklands were never merely about commerce. They were a microcosm of London itself, reflecting both the city's wealth and its inequalities. For the laborers who worked along the docks, life was grueling. Long hours were spent unloading heavy cargo, often without proper equipment or safety measures. Injuries were common, and death was not unheard of, whether from falling crates, accidents on slippery timber gangways, or sudden outbreaks of disease. Many dock workers were itinerant, moving from one ship to another, one wharf to another, in search of work. They were paid little and lived in conditions that would be considered unfit by today's standards. Yet for the wealthy merchants and ship owners, these men were simply a means to an end. The cargo mattered. The lives of the laborers were expendable. This stark divide between wealth and poverty, labor and profit, would become a defining characteristic of the Docklands. For centuries, the human cost of trade was not limited to the dock workers alone. The Docklands were also intimately tied to the global trade networks that included some of the most morally reprehensible practices of the time. Ships arriving from Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean sometimes carried human cargo, enslaved men, women, and children who were forced into labor under horrific conditions. The Thames became a conduit not just for goods, but for suffering. These enslaved individuals were often kept in the holds of ships, enduring overcrowding, disease, and brutality before ever reaching the docks. Once in London, they were sold, hidden, or put to work in labor-intensive trades. The Docklands were thus not just a center of commercial activity, but also a stage for the darkest aspects of global commerce, where human lives were commodified and devalued in pursuit of wealth. Alongside commerce, crime thrived in the Docklands. The very structure of the area, narrow alleys, dimly lit streets, and crowded housing created the perfect environment for lawlessness. From the earliest days of its existence, the Docklands were known for petty theft, smuggling, and organized criminal activity. Sailors arriving after long voyages were often easy targets for thieves and conmen. Goods that were supposed to be stored securely in warehouses sometimes disappeared, only to resurface in black markets far from the eyes of the authorities. Over time, gangs emerged, establishing control over territories and enforcing their own brutal codes of conduct. Violence was a constant reality, and many of the so-called enforcers and criminals became figures of fear and legend. Tales of brawls, robberies, and daring escapes circulated throughout London, feeding both the fascination and fear associated with the docks. The Docklands were also a place of transience, where countless lives intersected briefly before disappearing into obscurity. Sailors from all corners of the globe would arrive, work for a short period, and then vanish as quickly as they came, leaving behind a trail of stories, debts, and sometimes bodies. The area became a melting pot of languages, cultures, and traditions. But this diversity often intensified conflict. Rival gangs, competing labor groups, and merchants with vested interests created a volatile social environment where tensions could erupt into violence with little warning. Law enforcement struggled to maintain order, often turning a blind eye to some activities while brutally punishing others. Justice in the Docklands was selective, swift, and sometimes arbitrary, reflecting the complex web of power and corruption that governed the area. Beyond crime, the Docklands were infamous for the conditions in which people lived. Overcrowding was extreme. Families often lived in small rooms above warehouses, with multiple generations sharing limited space. Sanitation was minimal, and clean water was scarce. The combination of damp, poorly ventilated housing and constant exposure to the Thames created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. Cholera, typhoid, and smallpox were regular visitors to the area, claiming lives indiscriminately. Public health reforms came slowly, and many residents of the Docklands spent their entire lives in a cycle of sickness, poverty, and hardship. The streets were filled with the sick and dying, with hospitals and relief organizations struggling to provide even the most basic care. Life expectancy in the area was low, and childhood mortality rates were shockingly high. Despite the hardships, the Docklands were also a place of resilience and ingenuity. The people who lived and worked there developed networks of support, both formal and informal, to navigate the dangers and challenges of their environment. Informal economies flourished alongside the formal trade networks, with street vendors, hawkers, and small traders providing services and goods to residents and sailors alike. Communities formed along ethnic, cultural, and occupational lines, creating a patchwork of social connections that allowed people to survive in a harsh environment. These networks were fragile and often disrupted by the arrival of new groups or the enforcement of laws by authorities. But they were also vital to the survival of many residents. The Docklands were not static. They evolved over time, responding to changes in trade, technology, and society. As ships became larger and trade routes expanded, new warehouses and piers were constructed, further concentrating wealth and labor in the area. The introduction of steam-powered vessels and mechanized cranes transformed the pace and scale of work, but the underlying inequalities remained. The people who labored on the docks continued to face long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions, while the profits flowed upward to merchants, investors, and government officials. The physical landscape of the Docklands changed, but the social and economic dynamics that defined the area remained largely unchanged. The dark history of the Docklands also intersects with London's broader history of political and social conflict. Riots, strikes, and protests were common as workers sought better conditions, higher wages, and recognition of their rights. These confrontations were often met with harsh repression, including the use of military force and imprisonment. The Docklands were a microcosm of the struggles between labor and capital, power and resistance that shaped London and the broader United Kingdom. In many ways, the history of the Docklands can be seen as a lens through which to understand the broader forces of industrialization, urbanization, and globalization that defined modern history. Culturally, the Docklands also left an indelible mark on the city. Literature, art, and folklore captured the life and atmosphere of the area, often emphasizing its danger, mystery, and moral ambiguity. Tales of smuggling, piracy, and heroic or tragic figures were common in novels and newspapers. These stories both reflected and reinforced the perception of the Docklands as a place where anything could happen, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single night, and where life was lived on the edge. The area became a symbol of both opportunity and parole space, where the human capacity for both creativity and cruelty was vividly on display. As we look back on the Docklands today, it is tempting to focus on the modern developments, the financial institutions, and the luxury apartments. But to do so would be to ignore the rich and often troubling history. The past of the Docklands is not just a series of facts or dates. It is a tapestry of human experiences, of ambition and desperation, of cruelty and resilience. It is a history that challenges us to consider the costs of progress and the lives that were shaped and sometimes destroyed by the forces of commerce, industry, and urbanization. To walk along the Docklands is to walk on layers of history. Each one tells a story of struggle and survival, of power and vulnerability, of a city built on the backs of countless men and women whose names may never be known, but whose presence is felt in every brick, beam, and wharf. The Docklands remind us that history is never simply a record of events. It is a story of human beings, their choices, their suffering, and their triumphs. The dark history of this area is a testament to the resilience of those who lived through it, and a warning of the dangers of unchecked ambition and inequality. It is a history that invites reflection, demanding that we acknowledge not only the grandeur of London's rise as a global city, but also the shadows cast by that rise, shadows that continue to echo in the very streets and waters of the Docklands today. And so, as we begin this journey into the dark history of London's Docklands, we step not just into a physical space, but into a world of contrasts, of wealth and poverty, of commerce and crime, of life and death. It is a world that challenges our assumptions, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, and ultimately deepens our understanding of the city we live in or visit today. The Docklands, in all their complexity, are more than a historical curiosity. They are a mirror reflecting the human condition in all its resilience, cruelty, and complexity. They remind us that beneath the polished surface of any modern city, there are stories waiting to be told, stories of struggle, survival, and the enduring human spirit. The story of London's Docklands is inseparable from the story of London itself. For the riverside was not merely a place of commerce, but the beating heart of the city's growth as a global trading hub. From the 16th century onward, the Thames became a conduit through which wealth, goods, ideas, and people flowed into London from every corner of the known world. Ships of all sizes, from modest merchant vessels to large trading ships, arrived at the docks daily, carrying a variety of cargoes that would fuel the city's economy and expand its influence. The Docklands were, in many ways, a reflection of the world beyond England's shores, a point where the farthest reaches of Europe, Africa, and the Americas converged on the riverbanks of the capital. But while the wealth that passed through these docks would contribute to the city's prosperity, the human cost behind the trade was immense, and the Docklands became a theater for both the promise of opportunity and the harsh realities of exploitation. In the early years, the Docklands were little more than a collection of wharves, jetties, and rudimentary warehouses. They grew organically as London's demand for imported goods increased, and as the volume of trade multiplied, the infrastructure expanded in response. Timber and stone were used to construct piers capable of accommodating increasingly large ships, and warehouses rose along the banks to store goods until they could be distributed across the city or farther afield. But while the physical structures grew, the human labor required to sustain them was harsh, unregulated, and often brutally demanding. Men and women worked long hours unloading crates, sacks, barrels, and casks from ships that arrived from ports thousands of miles away. The work was physically exhausting, and safety was a concept largely ignored in favor of speed and efficiency. Injuries were frequent, and deaths on docks were considered unfortunate but unavoidable, incidents rarely meriting more than a passing notice. The workforce of the Docklands was a diverse but vulnerable group. Many were local Londoners who had grown up in the city's poorer neighborhoods, but a significant proportion were itinerant laborers moving from port to port in search of work. These men were often young and physically strong, but their transient lifestyle made them easy prey for exploitation and crime. Some were forced into difficult labor out of economic necessity, while others were coerced into it through debt or manipulation by foremen and dock managers. Women, too, played a crucial role in the docks. though their labor was often less visible. They carried out tasks such as sorting goods, mending sails, maintaining warehouses, and even assisting in loading ships. Yet their contributions were undervalued, and they were frequently subjected to harassment and marginalization within the mal-dominated environment of the docks. The economic structure of the Docklands created a stark and constant tension between labor and capital. The merchants and ship owners who profited from the trade saw the docks as a source of wealth, not a space where human life was to be protected or valued. They measured success in terms of goods imported and exported, profits made, and ships dispatched, largely ignoring the suffering of the workers who made it possible. The contrast between the opulence of merchant households and the deprivation of dock laborers was extreme. While the upper classes enjoyed luxury and comfort, the dock workers lived in overcrowded, unsanitary housing that was often directly above or adjacent to warehouses and wharves. These living conditions, combined with long working hours, poor diet, and exposure to the elements, created a population that was exhausted, vulnerable to illness, and perpetually on the edge of desperation. Among the most disturbing aspects of the Docklands' early history was its role in the transatlantic slave trade. London, like other European capitals, was deeply enmeshed in a network that commodified human life. Ships that docked on the Thames sometimes carried enslaved Africans packed into the holds of vessels in conditions that were horrifying, even by the standards of the time. These human beings were treated as cargo, counted alongside sugar, tobacco, and spices, and their survival during the voyage was a matter of financial concern rather than moral or ethical consideration. Upon arrival, enslaved individuals were often sold, hidden, or forced into labor within the city. The docks were the first point of entry into London for these individuals, and the human suffering that occurred there was an indelible part of the Docklands' history. While some of the enslaved managed to escape or find fleeting moments of autonomy, many were trapped in a cycle of exploitation that mirrored the broader injustices of the era. The presence of enslaved people and the reliance on extremely cheap labor contributed to the growth of informal hierarchies and social tensions within the Docklands. Workers competed fiercely for employment, sometimes undercutting each other's wages or working under unsafe conditions simply to secure a place on a ship or in a warehouse. Rivalries between different groups of laborers could erupt into violence, and the lack of effective oversight from authorities meant that disputes were often settled outside the law. Gangs and informal networks of enforcers emerged, asserting control over territories within the docks and ensuring that commerce could proceed according to their own rules. In many ways, the Docklands became a miniature society of its own, with codes of conduct, alliances, and conflicts that reflected the precarious balance between survival and profit. Crime was omnipresent in the Docklands, and it took many forms. Petty theft was common, with pickpockets targeting sailors and merchants, while smuggling became an essential part of the informal economy. Some merchants were complicit in illegal activities, hiding goods or manipulating records to avoid taxes and maximize profits. Others relied on criminal networks to transport goods discreetly or to recover shipments that had been stolen. The river itself, with its constantly shifting tides and hidden channels, provided an ideal environment for illicit activity. The Docks were a place where law was not always enforced, and where those with cunning, strength, or ruthlessness could thrive. Stories of daring heists, smuggling rings, and violent confrontations were common in newspapers and pamphlets of the time, feeding the perception of the Docklands as a lawless, dangerous space. Despite these dangers, the Docklands were also a place of opportunity, attracting people from across the British Isles and beyond. Immigrants arrived in search of work, bringing with them new skills, languages, and cultural practices. This diversity enriched the social fabric of the area, but it also created friction, competition for jobs, cultural misunderstandings, and existing social hierarchies meant that tension and conflict were a daily reality. Ethnic and occupational communities often formed their own networks of support, providing a semblance of security in an otherwise chaotic environment. Markets, taverns, and communal spaces became centers of social life, offering moments of respite and camaraderie. Amid the harsh realities of dock work, the physical environment of the Docklands shaped both daily life and social dynamics. The riverside was a constantly changing landscape, timber, jetties rotting, warehouses falling into disrepair, and new constructions rising to accommodate the increasing volume of trade. Narrow alleyways and winding streets made the area difficult to navigate, and the constant presence of ships, cranes, and cargo created hazards at every turn. At night, the docks were particularly dangerous. Poor lighting, slippery surfaces, and the proximity of the river meant that accidents were common, and criminal activity increased after dark. For many workers and residents, the combination of physical danger and social volatility, disease and sanitation were ever-present concerns. The Thames, which was vital for commerce, also became a source of contamination. Waste from the docks and nearby neighborhoods flowed directly into the river, creating ideal conditions for the spread of cholera, typhoid, and other illnesses. Overcrowded housing exacerbated the problem. As families lived in cramped quarters with minimal ventilation and limited access to clean water, public health interventions were slow to arrive, and many residents had little choice but to endure these conditions. The mortality rate in the Docklands was high, and the experience of illness and death was woven into the daily rhythms of life. Despite these hardships, the communities that developed in the Docklands demonstrated remarkable resilience, adapting to their environment and finding ways to survive under conditions that would overwhelm many others. The Docklands' evolution was also closely tied to technological and economic changes. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, the scale of trade increased dramatically. Ships grew larger, the variety of goods expanded, and new methods of storage and transport were introduced. Mechanization gradually began to change the pace and nature of work. But these innovations often displaced workers or created new risks. Labor disputes became more common as dock workers demanded better wages, safer conditions, and recognition of their rights. Strikes, protests, and occasional riots reflected the tension between the growing power of capital and the persistent struggle of labor to assert its place. The Docklands were a microcosm of broader economic and social transformations taking place in London and across Europe, illustrating both the possibilities and the perils of industrial and commercial expansion. Culturally, the Docklands left an enduring imprint on London. Literature, art, and folklore captured the life, dangers, and moral ambiguity of the area. Tales of smuggling, piracy, and heroic or tragic figures became popular stories, both reflecting and shaping public perceptions of the docks. These narratives emphasized the precariousness of life, the constant negotiation between survival and morality, and the ways in which ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. The Docklands thus became not only a place of economic activity, but also a powerful symbol in the cultural imagination of Londoners, representing both opportunity and danger, ingenuity and lawlessness. As the Docklands grew, it became increasingly clear that this was a place where the forces of commerce, labor, and human ambition collided in stark and often violent ways. Every crate unloaded, every ship docked, every transaction made was embedded within a broader network of power, inequality, and risk. The wealth that flowed through the docks was real, but so too were the human costs. Life in the Docklands demanded endurance, courage, and ingenuity, and those who survived often did so by navigating a world that was both brutal and mesmerizing, a place where the promise of prosperity coexisted with the ever-present threat of exploitation, illness, and violence. In tracing the origins and development of the Docklands, it becomes apparent that this was more than a physical location. It was a living, breathing system of commerce, labor, and social interaction. It was a space where the global and the local intersected, where distant political and economic forces manifested in the lives of ordinary men, women, and children. The docks were a crucible shaping the people who lived and worked there, and in turn being shaped by them. The history of the Docklands is a story of contrasts between wealth and poverty, safety and danger, opportunity and exploitation. Understanding this history requires attention not only to ships, warehouses, and goods, but also to the human experiences that gave the area its character, complexity, and at times infamy. And so, as we explore the birth and rise of the Docklands, we see a place of contradictions, a site where ambition and desperation met, where commerce and crime intertwined, and where every shipment carried with it not only goods, but also stories of labor, struggle, and survival. The Docklands were, and in many ways remain, a mirror reflecting both the grandeur and the shadows of London itself. In their history, we find lessons about resilience, the human cost of progress, and the complex interplay between wealth, power, and the ordinary lives of those who inhabit a city's most vital spaces. The legacy of these early years of the Docklands is not confined to the past. It continues to inform the character of the area, the culture of the city, and our understanding of the forces that shaped modern London. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Docklands had developed a reputation that extended far beyond the boundaries of London itself. While the riverside had long been a center of trade and commerce, it had also become infamous as a breeding ground for crime, violence, and lawlessness. The combination of immense wealth, transient populations, and minimal oversight created a unique ecosystem in which both opportunity and danger coexisted in an uneasy balance. Sailors, merchants, laborers, and opportunists from across Europe and beyond converged in this space, each navigating its social and physical complexities in ways that could secure prosperity or seal their downfall. To understand the underworld of the Docklands, one must consider not only the crimes that occurred, but also the social, economic, and environmental factors that allowed such a shadow society to thrive. The Docklands were a perfect environment for criminal activity. The narrow streets and winding alleys between warehouses provided ample hiding places for thieves and cutthroats. The constant arrival and departure of ships meant that there was a continual influx of newcomers, many of whom were unfamiliar with the local terrain and customs. Sailors, who had endured long and exhausting voyages, often carried cash, valuables, or goods that were easily converted into money, making them prime targets for pickpockets, conmen, and gangs. The river itself, with its tides, mudflats, and hidden inlets, provided both an escape route for criminals and a stage for illicit activity that could occur out of sight of the authorities. The very infrastructure that supported commerce, the warehouses, jetties, and quays, also created opportunities for theft, smuggling, and fraud, turning the docks into a space where law and disorder constantly collided. One of the most notorious aspects of Docklands crime was the presence of river pirates and mudlarks. River pirates were not the swashbuckling figures romanticized in popular culture. They were ruthless, opportunistic men who preyed on ships, cargo, and the laborers themselves. Some operated in loosely organized gangs, using knowledge of tides and the river's hidden channels to raid ships at night or intercept valuable goods before they could reach warehouses. Mudlarks, on the other hand, were scavengers who combed the mudflats at low tide, searching for anything of value that had been discarded, lost, or stolen. Their activities were often desperate, born of poverty and necessity. Yet they also contributed to a larger economy of crime that intersected with smugglers, fences, and black market traders. In some of the darker tales of the Docklands, mudlarks were said to have uncovered human remains, which were then sold for anatomical study or other grim purposes, illustrating the extreme and macabre lengths to which some individuals would go to survive. Organized gangs emerged as another defining feature of the Docklands underworld. These groups were territorial, controlling specific stretches of the river or clusters of warehouses, and enforcing their own rules through violence and intimidation. Gang members often had specialized roles. Some acted as enforcers, others as fences for stolen goods, and still others as lookouts or informants. Conflicts between rival gangs could erupt into bloody street battles, sometimes lasting for days, and law enforcement was often unable or unwilling to intervene effectively. Corruption played a significant role in maintaining this balance of power. Some constables and officials were complicit, accepting bribes to overlook certain crimes or to protect particular gangs, while others were too outnumbered or too isolated to enforce the law consistently. In this environment, survival required cunning, loyalty, and sometimes sheer brute force. The types of crime that flourished in the Docklands were varied and reflected both the opportunities presented by commerce and the desperation of those living in poverty. Petty theft, pickpocketing, and burglary were common, as were more organized forms of larceny, such as warehouse raids or shipboard robberies. Smuggling was another pervasive activity, fueled by high tariffs and the potential for profit. Goods ranging from tea and tobacco to alcohol and textiles could be moved secretly through hidden channels, often with the complicity of merchants. seeking to maximize profits. Fraud and deceit were also commonplace. Conmen and swindlers preyed on newcomers, selling worthless goods or concocting elaborate schemes that could leave victims financially ruined. Boundaries between legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise were often blurred, creating an environment in which morality was flexible and pragmatism was paramount. Violence was an element of Docklands life, not limited to gang conflicts. The docks were a physically dangerous place, and injuries sustained during labor or accidents often intersected with criminal activity. Disputes over wages, territory, or stolen goods frequently escalated into deadly confrontations, and some deaths were quietly attributed to accidents rather than deliberate acts of violence. Murder, though less common than theft, was not unheard. Avon, some individuals became infamous for their ruthlessness. Taverns and public houses along the riverside served as both social hubs and sites of confrontation, where arguments could quickly turn violent and where alliances and rivalries were forged and tested. The omnipresence of danger shaped the behavior of those living and working in the docks, instilling a constant awareness of vulnerability and the need for self-protection, where individuals navigated difficult ethical choices in order to survive. Many dock workers engaged in petty crime not out of inherent criminality, but out of necessity, supplementing their meager wages or ensuring that their families could survive. Similarly, merchants who participated in smuggling or bribed officials often justified their actions as business pragmatism rather than immorality. The blurred line between legality and illegality, survival and exploitation, created a social landscape in which judgment was difficult and alliances were fluid in many cases. The community itself provided informal mechanisms of regulation, with social norms and codes of conduct shaping behavior in ways that the formal legal system did not. The presence of transient populations further complicated the social dynamics of crime in the Docklands. Sailors, laborers, and immigrants arrived with little knowledge of the local environment, making them vulnerable to exploitation, but also capable of contributing to criminal networks. Seasonal labor meant that new faces were constantly appearing. With them came new opportunities for theft. The docks were a place of constant movement, and the ability to navigate this shifting landscape was essential for both survival and success. Some individuals thrived by mastering the rhythms of the river, understanding tides and trade schedules, and forming strategic alliances, while others fell victim to misfortune or inexperience. The Docklands underworld was not static. It evolved over time in response to changes in trade, technology, and society. As ships grew larger and mechanized equipment was introduced, certain forms of labor became less reliant on brute force, while others demanded new skills. Criminal enterprises adapted accordingly, finding new ways to exploit weaknesses in the system or to capitalize on emerging opportunities. Similarly, law enforcement and regulatory mechanisms gradually expanded, introducing new forms of oversight, policing, and public health intervention. These changes did not eliminate crime, but reshaped it, forcing those engaged in illicit activity to innovate and adapt. In this sense, the Docklands were a dynamic ecosystem responsive to both internal and external pressures, and defined by the ongoing interplay between order and disorder. Culturally, the Docklands underworld left a lasting imprint on London. Stories of pirates, thieves, and cunning laborers were recounted in newspapers, pamphlets, and literature, capturing the imagination of the public and contributing to a broader mythology of the docks. Writers and artists were drawn to the area's dramatic contrasts, the juxtaposition of wealth and poverty, the ever-present danger of the river, and the moral ambiguity of life in a space where survival often required bending or breaking the law. Folklore and legend emerged from real events, with tales of daring escapes, treacherous betrayals, and unexpected acts of heroism weaving together. Historical and mythical, these narratives both reflected and reinforced the perception of the Docklands as a morally complex and thrillingly dangerous environment. The human stories within the Docklands criminal landscape were diverse and often tragic. Families of dock workers lived in constant fear, knowing that their livelihoods and even their safety could be threatened at any moment. Children grew up observing the rhythms of crime and survival, learning from an early age how to navigate a world in which risk and opportunity were inseparable. Women, who were often overlooked in historical accounts, played significant roles as merchants, laborers, informants, and even participants in criminal enterprises, negotiating the precarious balance between social expectations and economic necessity. These personal experiences reveal the multifaceted reality of life in the Docklands, where ordinary people were simultaneously victims, participants, and witnesses to a complex social order defined by both commerce and crime. The Docklands underworld also intersected with broader political and economic forces. Trade policies, taxation, and international commerce shaped opportunities for smuggling and illicit activity, while law enforcement strategies and public policy influenced the distribution of power and risk within the docks. Corruption, favoritism, and selective enforcement created incentives for criminal behavior and reinforced existing hierarchies. At the same time, global events such as wars, revolutions, and economic crises could dramatically alter the dynamics of crime, creating new opportunities and new dangers. Understanding the Docklands, therefore, requires looking beyond individual acts of crime or moments of suffering. It demands a recognition of the intricate systems, economic, social, political, that shaped life along the Thames. It asks us to remember not only the grand architecture of empire and trade, but also the quiet endurance of those who bore its weight in the end. The Docklands stand as a testament to the duality of human endeavor, where progress and pain, creation and destruction, walked hand in hand along the river's edge. Their story is not just London's, it is ours. The Docklands underworld requires attention not only to local conditions, but also to the larger forces that shaped the environment in which individuals lived and worked. Disease and poor living conditions intersected with crime in ways that further complicated life in the Docklands. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and contaminated water created an environment in which illness was a constant threat. The sick and dying were often the most vulnerable to criminal exploitation, while burial practices, disposal of bodies, and the presence of human remains became entwined with the darker aspects of Docklands life. Mudlarks scavenging the riverbanks for anything of value, including, in some grim cases, human remains illustrate the extreme lengths to which individuals would go to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. These conditions reinforced the perception of the Docklands as a morally ambiguous, dangerous, and unpredictable space. Yet, despite the pervasive danger and criminal activity, the Docklands were also a place of opportunity, resilience, and ingenuity. Many individuals found ways to navigate the risks, forming alliances, mastering the local geography, and developing skills that allowed them to thrive. Communities, both formal and informal, emerged to provide support, protection, and mutual assistance. Social networks, family ties, and occupational affiliations helped individuals survive and sometimes prosper in an environment that was otherwise unforgiving. In this sense, the Docklands underworld was not merely a site of crime and exploitation. It was also a crucible in which resourcefulness, cunning, and adaptability were essential for survival. As we examine the criminal landscape of the Docklands, it becomes evident that this was not a monolithic or static phenomenon. Crime existed on multiple levels, from petty theft to organized smuggling, from opportunistic violence to calculated acts of murder. It was shaped by social, economic, and environmental factors, and it interacted with the broader currents of London's growth as a commercial capital. The underworld of the Docklands was both a reflection of and a response to the pressures of urban life, providing a lens through which to understand the complexities of human behavior, social hierarchy, and economic inequality. It was a world in which survival often depended on moral flexibility, courage, and the ability to navigate a constantly shifting landscape of risk and reward. In tracing the history of crime in the Docklands, one also encounters the human stories that lie at the heart of this shadowy world. Men and women, young and old, rich and poor, left their mark on the docks, whether through acts of heroism, survival, betrayal, or ruthlessness. These stories reveal the human dimensions of the underworld, illustrating how individuals adapted to extreme conditions, negotiated social hierarchies, and pursued their own goals in a context defined by both opportunity and danger. They remind us that the history of the Docklands is not merely a record of events, but a narrative of human experience, resilience, and moral complexity. And so, the Docklands underworld emerges as a central theme in the history of London's riverside. It is a story of danger and ingenuity, of lawlessness and survival, of cruelty and compassion. It is a story that intersects with commerce, labor, and social change, reflecting the broader dynamics of a city and a world in transformation. To walk along the docks is to walk through centuries of human experience, where every alley, warehouse, and riverbank bears witness to the struggles, ambitions, and moral dilemmas of those who lived, worked, and sometimes perished in this extraordinary place. The underworld of the Docklands is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a vital key to understanding the character of London itself, revealing both the shadows and the resilience that have shaped the city over time. Life in London's Docklands during the 18th and 19th centuries was defined by extremes, and nowhere were those extremes more evident than in the conditions endured by those who lived in its shadow. The Thames, so vital for trade and commerce, was also a source of relentless hardship. While merchants and shipowners prospered, those who labored along the river or in its surrounding neighborhoods faced The daily realities of the Docklands were shaped not only by physical labor and economic inequality, but also by social, environmental, and health conditions that made existence precarious at best and deadly at worst. To understand the Docklands fully, it is essential to explore this harsh landscape of poverty and illness, to grasp the human cost of London's rise as a global commercial power, and to confront the stark contrast between wealth and squalor that defined this area for centuries. The Docklands were home to a dense, sprawling population, much of it transient, much of it living in extreme deprivation. Workers' homes were often makeshift structures, built directly above or alongside warehouses and wharves constructed of timber and brick, but lacking basic infrastructure. Families crowded into single rooms, sometimes with multiple generations sharing space so confined that privacy was virtually non-existent. Children slept in corners alongside infants, while adults occupied narrow beds or straw-stuffed mattresses. These rooms were damp and poorly ventilated, exposed to the smells of the river, the sweat of labor, and the stench of waste. Daily life involved navigating physical discomfort from cold floors and leaking roofs to overcrowded spaces that amplified the spread of illness. Even for those who worked tirelessly unloading ships or maintaining warehouses, home offered no respite. The boundaries between work and domestic life were blurred, with every aspect of existence suffused with hardship. Sanitation was almost non-existent. The Thames, which sustained the docks and provided water for industry and transport, also became a receptacle for human and industrial waste. Chamber pots and open drains emptied directly into the river or the narrow streets, producing a constant miasma of odor and contamination. With little access to clean water, families were forced to use the same polluted sources for drinking, cooking, and washing. The presence of excrement, rotting food, and industrial byproducts created an environment in which bacteria and disease could flourish. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox, sweeping through neighborhoods with terrifying speed and leaving devastation in their wake. Children were especially vulnerable, with many dying before reaching adolescence. Survival depended on a combination of luck, resilience, and social support. And yet, death was an ever-present companion in daily life. Disease was compounded by the physical hazards of work. Dock workers faced grueling labor carrying heavy cargoes, balancing on wet planks, and operating primitive equipment. Accidents were common. Injuries ranged from crushed limbs and fractured bones to fatal falls into the river. Hospitals and medical care were limited, expensive, and often inaccessible to the poorest residents. Many families were forced to care for the sick at home, relying on home remedies, herbal treatments, or faith, while watching helplessly as disease claimed life after life. Epidemics struck not only the laboring class, but also those living in makeshift housing in the surrounding neighborhoods, creating a cycle of illness and death that perpetuated poverty. Poverty in the Docklands was pervasive, absolute, and intergenerational. Wages for dock workers were minimal and unreliable, often tied to the tides of commerce, the whims of employers, and the hazards of seasonal demand. When ships were delayed, storms disrupted shipping, or economic downturns struck, Entire families could be left without income. Credit and debt were constant concerns, with workers borrowing from local merchants or informal lenders to feed their families or pay rent. Failure to repay could result in eviction, imprisonment, or forced labor. Children were often drawn into the workforce at a young age, taking on tasks that were dangerous and exhausting, further blurring the line between childhood and adult responsibility. The physical environment of the Docklands amplified the impact of poverty. The area was prone to flooding, with the Thames regularly rising over quays and streets carrying both debris and disease. Floodwaters could destroy homes, ruin food supplies, and spread contaminated water into living spaces. Fire was another constant threat. Warehouses packed with goods and timber structures created conditions in which a single spark could escalate into a catastrophic blaze. The combination of flood, fire, and disease created a precarious existence in which survival was uncertain, and each day demanded resilience and adaptability. Social inequality in the Docklands was stark and unforgiving. Wealthy merchants lived in contrast to the suffering along the riverbanks and hating grand houses, or enjoying luxury beyond the imagination of laborers. This disparity was not simply a matter of material difference, but shaped social relations, power structures, and access to protection and opportunity. Workers were often subject to arbitrary authority, exploited for their labor while denied basic rights. The area became a microcosm of broader societal divisions, with the docks functioning as a space where class inequality was both visible and unyielding. The Docklands were also a hub for informal economies that both alleviated and reinforced poverty. Street markets, hawkers, and small traders emerged to meet the needs of residents, providing food, clothing, and services in exchange for cash or barter. These activities allowed some families to survive, but also reflected the fragility of their position within the broader economic system. Crime often intersected with these informal economies. Smuggling and fraud were intertwined with legitimate commerce, creating an environment in which moral ambiguity was normalized, and survival often required bending or breaking rules. Children in the Docklands were acutely affected by the conditions of disease and poverty. Many began working at a young age, carrying cargo, assisting in warehouses, or scavenging along riverbanks. Education was a luxury that few could afford, and illiteracy was common. Life expectancy for children was shockingly low. Many witnessed illness and death from an early age. Yet, amid the harshness, communities developed mechanisms for resilience. Families, neighbors, and informal support networks provided care, guidance, and protection even in the absence of formal institutions. These bonds, fragile yet vital, allowed life to continue despite overwhelming adversity. Women in the Docklands played crucial but often invisible roles. They managed households under impossible conditions, cared for sick family members, and contributed to labor, both paid and unpaid, in ways that sustained entire households. Some women found work in warehouses, taverns, or markets. Others engaged in informal or illicit activities to supplement family income. They navigated dangers that included sexual harassment, exploitation, and the constant threat. Their stories, often overlooked in historical accounts, are central to understanding the social fabric of the Docklands and the human capacity for survival under harsh circumstances. The psychological toll of life in the Docklands was immense. Chronic poverty, exposure to disease, and the constant presence of death created conditions of fear, stress, and anxiety. Individuals were forced to develop coping strategies to survive, whether through social networks, work routines, or engagement in informal economies. Alcohol and other substances were often used as relief from the harsh realities of daily life. Yet, these coping mechanisms could also create new dangers and dependencies. Mental and emotional suffering was as real and pervasive as physical hardship, shaping behavior, relationships, and community life in profound ways. Epidemics in the Docklands revealed the stark contrasts between wealth and poverty. While affluent merchants could afford private care, access to clean water, and isolation during outbreaks, the poor were left to endure illness in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Entire neighborhoods could be decimated by cholera or typhoid, with survivors facing grief, trauma, and economic ruin. Public health measures arrived slowly and inconsistently, and the burden of disease was disproportionately borne by those least able to protect themselves. These conditions underscored the systemic inequalities that defined life in the Docklands and illuminated the human cost of London's economic growth. The physical and social environment of the Docklands created a cycle of deprivation that was difficult to escape. Families were trapped in overcrowded housing, working in hazardous labor, and dependent on precarious income streams. The lack of education, healthcare, and social mobility reinforced poverty across generations, creating a self-perpetuating system in which survival required resourcefulness, resilience, and at times moral compromise, even as the city around them grew in wealth and influence. Those living in the Docklands were often excluded from its benefits, left to navigate a world of extremes with limited support or protection. Despite the adversity, the Docklands were also a place of community, solidarity, and human ingenuity. Residents developed informal networks to share resources, provide childcare, and care for the sick. Street markets and communal spaces became centers of social life, offering moments of respite, camaraderie, and connection. These communities were fragile, subject to disruption by economic shifts, crime, and disease. Yet they were essential for survival. They allowed individuals and families to endure conditions that might otherwise have been insurmountable, and they shaped a culture of resilience and adaptability that would define the area for centuries. The Docklands also served as a site of labor organization and resistance. Workers were of their The Docklands' history of disease and deprivation is a crucial counterpoint to its narrative of commerce and wealth. While goods moved efficiently along the river, and fortunes were made by merchants and traders, the laborers who enabled this prosperity endured suffering and hardship that was often invisible to those who benefited from it. The contrast between the opulence of London's rising commercial class and the daily realities of Docklands residents underscores the moral and social questions inherent in the city's development. It is a reminder that behind every flourishing economy are the human stories of those who labored, struggled, and often perished to make that prosperity possible. Ultimately, the Docklands' history of disease, poverty, and squalor reveals both the vulnerability and the resilience of its people. It demonstrates the human cost of industrial and commercial expansion and illuminates the social structures and environmental conditions that shaped life in one of London's most important but most challenging neighborhoods. To walk the streets of the Docklands, whether in the past or today's, to witness the layers of struggle and survival that define this extraordinary area. It is to understand that every brick, every alley, and every warehouse is a testament not only to commerce but to the endurance of those who lived and labored in conditions that were often harsh, unforgiving, and relentlessly demanding. By the early 20th century, the Docklands were entering a period of profound change, a transformation that would redefine the physical landscape, social fabric, and economic function of the area. For centuries, the docks had been the beating heart of London's maritime commerce, a bustling nexus of ships, warehouses, laborers, and goods that connected the city to the wider world. But as technology, trade patterns, and global economics shifted, the Docklands' former vitality began to wane, leaving behind a landscape marked by decline, uncertainty, and vulnerability. The very forces that had made the area prosperous, its access to the river, its concentration of labor, its integration into global trade, also made it particularly susceptible to disruption, whether from technological innovation, economic downturns, or the devastating impact of war. The decline of the Docklands was a gradual but unmistakable process, beginning with the evolution of shipping technology and logistics. By the late 19th century, steamships were replacing traditional sailing vessels than their larger size required, more sophisticated infrastructure than the Docklands could provide. Warehouses, piers, and cranes, designed for smaller cargoes, were increasingly inadequate, and much of the riverfront became obsolete for the largest and most profitable ships. The introduction of mechanized cargo handling, including cranes and conveyor systems, reduced the need for large labor forces, disrupting the traditional employment patterns that had sustained generations of dock workers. Jobs that had once been plentiful became scarce. Wages stagnated, and families that had relied on the rhythms of dock labor faced economic insecurity. This technological shift created not only material hardship but also social disruption as established communities struggled to adapt to the changing demands of commerce. The economic decline of the Docklands was closely tied to the broader fluctuations of the global economy. London's status as a commercial capital depended on its connections to ports around the world, and any disruption to trade could have immediate local consequences. Recessions, market collapses, and shifting trade routes all contributed to periods of unemployment and underemployment in the docks. Shipping companies consolidated, smaller operators went bankrupt, and merchant families who had once dominated trade increasingly moved their operations elsewhere. The Docklands, once vibrant and crowded with activity, began to feel the effects of abandonment. Warehouses stood empty, piers deteriorated, and streets that had once thronged with the sounds of labor and commerce grew quiet. The physical decay of the area mirrored the social and economic decay, creating an atmosphere of neglect and desolation. The decline of the Docklands was not only economic but also social. Long-standing patterns of poverty and crime, which had always characterized the area to some extent, became more pronounced as opportunities diminished. Unemployment, overcrowding, and deprivation intensified, contributing to rising crime rates and social tension. Gangs and informal criminal networks, which had adapted over the centuries to the rhythms of legitimate trade, now found themselves competing over scarcer resources. Smuggling, theft, and illicit trade continued, but the stakes were higher and the consequences more desperate. The moral and social fabric of the community, already tested by generations of hardship, was further strained as families struggled to survive in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to their suffering. This period of decline coincided with the devastating impact of the First World War, which placed extraordinary demands on London's port infrastructure, while simultaneously exposing it to risk. During the war, the Docklands were crucial for the import of food, weapons, and materials necessary to sustain both the military and civilian populations. Labor shortages caused by conscription and wartime casualties strained the workforce, leading to even harsher conditions for those who remained. The docks were also subject to heightened security measures, surveillance, and military oversight. The area remained a hub of activity, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of the dock workers and merchants, who continued to sustain commerce under extraordinary circumstances. The interwar period brought a temporary reprieve in some areas. Global trade recovered, and the Docklands attempted to modernize. However, the infrastructure remained largely outdated, and competition from emerging ports around the world placed additional pressures on London's riverfront. Labor disputes, strikes, and unrest became more common as workers sought to secure fair wages, improve conditions, and protect their livelihoods. These conflicts were often violent, with clashes between dock workers, private security, and law enforcement, highlighting the deep social tensions that had developed over generations. At the same time, poverty, overcrowding, and disease continued to affect the most vulnerable residents, creating a stark contrast between the opulence enjoyed by a few and the ongoing deprivation experienced by many. The Second World War would transform the Docklands in ways that were both immediate and lasting. During the Blitz, London's riverside became a strategic target for German bombers, and the Docklands suffered heavily. Warehouses, cranes, and piers were destroyed. Ships were sunk or damaged, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Thousands of lives were lost. Survivors were left homeless, traumatized, and uncertain about the future. The destruction was indiscriminate. The commercial infrastructure that supported global trade, the homes of laborers and families, and the streets and alleys that had defined the area for centuries were all affected. Bombing raids created not only physical devastation, but also psychological scars. Communities struggled to cope with loss, displacement, and the constant threat of further attacks. The impact of wartime destruction on the Docklands was compounded by the displacement of populations. Many families were evacuated, and those who remained faced rationing, shortages, and the disruption of social networks. Laborers who had once relied on steady work in the docks found themselves in uncertain employment. The war effort redirected resources and personnel. The destruction of infrastructure further disrupted trade creep, shortages, and economic hardship that extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of the riverfront. In the post-war years, these conditions would leave the Docklands vulnerable to continued decline. As broader London began to rebuild and modernize, the post-war period highlighted the structural weaknesses that had accumulated over centuries. Traditional docks designed for older ships and cargo handling methods were increasingly ill-suited to modern shipping, which relied on containerization, cranes, and deep-water berths. Many warehouses were irreparably damaged during the war, and reconstruction was slowed due to limited resources and competing priorities. Unemployment remained high and social deprivation persisted, creating an environment in which crime, informal economies, and social unrest continued to thrive. The Docklands were, in many ways, frozen in time, a relic of a bygone era, struggling to adapt to the realities of the modern world. Despite these challenges, the resilience of the communities in the Docklands remained evident. Families rebuilt homes, informal networks of support continued to function, and workers adapted to new technologies and changing economic conditions. Yet the scars of war and decline were visible everywhere. Empty streets, ruined warehouses, and derelict quays served as constant reminders of both the human and material costs of industrial and military transformation. The area was marked by contrasts, with pockets of activity and renewal existing alongside spaces of decay and abandonment, creating a landscape that was both historically rich and socially complex. The decline and devastation of the Docklands also had cultural implications. Literature, newspapers, and oral histories captured the experiences of those who lived through these periods of change, preserving stories of survival, loss, and adaptation. Artists and writers were drawn to the area's dramatic contrasts, depicting the ruins of warehouses, the crowded streets of